Hey guys, this is Brian with UFO Book Review. I'm back with another review today. I'm going to be talking about the book Witnessed, the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge abductions, written by author Bud Hopkins. Now this book right here, as you can see, it's a fairly thick book. It's 370 odd pages there. And this was written in 1996. It's based on the events that occurred on November the 30th, I believe, 1989. And here's a cover of the book there, if you can see. Hope there's not too much glare there. But this book was reviewed by the Houston Chronicle, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Kirkus Reviews. And they gave it some pretty high remarks and stuff. So when I saw this at the local bookstore, I thought I'd pick it up. I didn't know anything about it. So I checked it out, and this is kind of my first impression. Is the author himself I didn't know much about, but after reading the book, I kind of get the impression that Mr. Hopkins is a very kind and caring individual. He seems to be very interested not only in the subject of UFOs, but in the subject that he was writing about. In other words, the lady that's the subject of this book, Linda Corteil. He seems to be very interested in her as an individual. So he seems to be very kind and caring and thoughtful, and just seems to be a very, very earnest individual. That's kind of the impressions I get from what I've read and some of the things in this book. So that's my first impression of the author. And let me tell you a little bit about this story. You may not be familiar with it as well, but this story is basically on the night of November the 30th, 1989. A lady by the name of Linda Corteil was said to have been abducted from her apartment building, which is some, multiple stories up in the air. There was a UFO outside the window. A bright light beamed her outside, floated her outside of the apartment building in midair. And in this beam of light, there were three other small individuals, later to be described as alien creatures in this book. And she was floated out the window and then up into the UFO, and the UFO darted off and dove into the East River and reemerged sometime later on a beach, as you'll find out in the story. As the story progresses, we learn that there were two initial witnesses to this event that were basically at the base of her building in an automobile, and we later learn their names are Richard and Dan. And at first it's thought that they are New York police detectives, because that's how they represent themselves. In any case, as this story progresses, Bud Hopkins tries to locate Richard and Dan. They never are able to do so. And again, as it progresses, you find out that no, they're not actually detectives. They're possibly CIA or FBI, or they work with the UN. And then you also find out later in the story that there's a third witness that Dan and Richard were actually protecting during this night. They had him in the back of the car, and he's known as the third man, who later you find out is some important diplomat or some high-ranking government official. And the story just keeps progressing, and it's this tale of trying to figure out who saw what. Do all the eyewitnesses' accounts seem to agree? And in the book, the eyewitnesses' accounts do agree, and Mr. Hopkins does a good job of showing how they agree and that type of thing. Now that is basically the book in a nutshell. I mean, it's very short. Basically, she was abducted, and also not only was she abducted, but the book says that during basically her whole life, even from the time she was a little girl, she had multiple meetings with Richard, that actually witnessed the event, that they were friends, and then later forced to be bonded together sexually, and then they had a child together. So that's, the story just keeps progressing like this. But in any case, now, I personally have some issues with the way the story evolves. I mean, it is kind of an interesting story. It is highly unique. The thing for me that really jumps out is the story is highly bizarre. And I was thinking if there's another word I could use, but bizarre is really the only word I can think of. It is just so bizarre. It starts out off normally, well, I wouldn't say that's a normal situation, seeing someone floated outside a window, but as the story progresses and just gets more involved, I mean, later on, Richard and Dan kidnap Linda multiple times. They both end up falling in love with her. her whole family's abducted, other families are abducted. It's just, I don't know. It has this really unusual bizarrity, if that's a word, which it's probably not. This is really utterly bizarre. And then the second main issue I have with the book is that this entire story hinges on three people. Linda Cortile, who is the abductee, and then also Richard and Dan, who supposedly saw the event. And they are so heavily involved in the story of this book. If you were to remove those two characters, the book wouldn't exist, probably. The issue I have with those three characters, especially Richard and Dan, is that Bud Hopkins never met them personally, ever. He never met Richard and he never met Dan. Hopkins does say that basically the reason he never met is because of the position that these two men hold in whatever line of work it is that they do, protecting or whatever service they fulfill in the government. This is probably for his reason for never being able to meet them. But he does correspond with them but when they correspond with Mr. Hopkins, it's always through a typewritten message on typewriters, always. Dan does that. Richard does that. Actually, many witnesses, so-called in this book, correspond with Mr. Hopkins through a typewriter. Now, Hopkins does say in the book that some people complained and said, hey, that could be a hoax, but then he says, well, the messages, it's clear to see that the type is different. It was obviously different typewriters, and so it can't be a hoax, kind of is what he's saying. However, at the time, in the 80s, typewriters are very common, and you could go to your local library and there's multiple typewriters there. One person could sit down and type a letter at each different typewriter, and they're all going to look different. So that's a major issue I have with the book. And it's interesting, I was reading a book the other day, not a UFO related book, but it was a political science book, and the guy basically in the opening chapter made a comment that something like, if Winston Churchill said something and the homeless man said something, who are you going to believe? Well, most people are going to answer that they're going to believe Winston Churchill. And then the author of that book said, pardon me, he said, that's the wrong answer. It's not who said it, it's what did they say. And I think that's a really strong advice. It's really good advice. So even though I think Mr. Hopkins seems to be, I don't think he's out to deceive anyone by any means. I don't, none of that. I think he seems to be a pretty good person, nice individual. But what is he saying? So as I evaluate the information, I don't think it's very scientific at all. I mean, it cannot be, none of this can be validated by outside sources. Now, he does, in my opinion, okay? Now, he does include some photographs in this book. Let me turn to them, I'll show you. And this is supposed to be, in his mind, like wonderful evidence. So here's a picture of the building. There's drawings in the book. UFO abducting her with the little aliens outside. Now, this is supposed to be a photograph. I don't know if you can see there. But that's a photograph of Linda, supposedly after she's been kidnapped by Dan, and he takes her to some island beach house. She escapes and runs across the beach, and somehow, he takes photographs of her. And so, I mean, that's the kind of photos in the book. It's just a bunch of drawings. And something that Hopkins really found interesting was an x-ray that Linda had done, and there's supposed to be like some type of device in her nostril that's not there anymore, of course. I gotta say that probably if you read this book and you're a believer of the abduction phenomenon, this will probably fuel your fire to, you may be inclined to just say, aha, see, it's true. If you're a skeptic, you're probably going to read this book and see, aha, see, it can't be. And you may be asking, well, what are you, Brian? Well, here's what I have to say on that. I don't like to tell you my personal viewpoint on whether or not I think a book is true or not. But the way I approach things is I always try to keep an open mind about everything, but I'm very interested in the scientific method. I like things that can be researched or investigated further by more than just one person. And, am I saying that this book is not true? No. Am I saying there's a possibility it's not true? Yes. Is there a possibility that it is true? That could also be the case. I think it's for the reader to decide, and you should probably check out the book and make up your own mind on this. But this is Witnessed by Bud Hopkins. I'll put a link in the doobly-doo below and you can check it out yourself. Now, as far as my next review, actually, let me give this a star rating. 1 to 5 stars, 3 stars for me. It was so bizarre that I have a hard time taking it seriously. Although I've done some outside research myself, so I took it as serious as I possibly could. And but I'm still gonna have to say 3 out of 5 stars. I don't highly recommend it, but I can see that it's an important book, so you guys might like it. It's just for me, it's just too bizarre. In any case, I'm not sure what I'm gonna do for my next review yet, so I might take a vacation from reading for a couple weeks. I haven't decided yet, but in any case, I'll come back with another review, and I hope you'll tune in. Until then, thanks for watching. Take care.